She never meant to find out that way, and that was the cruelest part of it all. Because betrayal did not arrive with a confession or a dramatic argument, but slipped quietly into her life through a moment so ordinary it almost felt harmless, as she reached for his phone on the kitchen counter, not to snoop, not to check anything, but simply because hers had died and she needed to call her sister. And in that brief, careless moment, the screen lit up with a message that was not meant for her eyes. A name she did not recognize, followed by words that did not belong to a stranger. Words that carried familiarity, intimacy, and a confidence that made her breath catch. And as she stood there frozen, phone trembling slightly in her hand, she felt time stretch unnaturally, as if her mind was desperately trying to protect her by slowing everything down. And in those seconds, she understood that some truths do not announce themselves loudly, they reveal themselves quietly, leaving you alone to piece together what your heart already knows but has been too afraid to admit. She told herself not to jump to conclusions, repeating the words in her mind like a quiet prayer. Yet no matter how many times she tried to rationalize what she had seen, the message refused to soften, refusing to become harmless or explainable. And as she placed the phone back exactly where it had been, her hands moved automatically while her thoughts raced, replaying the tone of the words, the familiarity behind them, the unmistakable implication that this was not the first exchange of its kind. And when he walked back into the kitchen moments later, smiling casually and asking who she needed to call, she looked at him differently for the first time, not as the man she trusted without question, but as someone whose life might contain parts she had never been invited into. And as she answered him calmly, forcing her voice to remain steady, she realized how quickly innocence can disappear, how a single accidental moment can fracture years of certainty. And standing there between what she had known and what she was beginning to suspect, she understood that betrayal does not always require intention to discover. Sometimes it reveals itself simply because the truth grows tired of hiding. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur, as if she were moving through familiar spaces that no longer belonged to her. And while he went about his routines, answering calls, checking emails, laughing at small jokes, she watched him with a quiet intensity she had never felt before, noticing details that once felt meaningless, the way his phone never left his side, the subtle hesitation before he responded to certain questions, the careful neutrality of his tone when he spoke about his plans. And with every observation, the accidental discovery from earlier grew heavier, settling deeper into her thoughts. And by the time evening arrived, she realized that what hurt most was not the possibility of another woman, but the realization that she had been living beside someone capable of hiding an entire emotional world from her. And sitting alone later that night, replaying the message in her mind again and again, she understood that once doubt enters a relationship, it changes the meaning of everything that follows, because even silence begins to feel like a conversation filled with answers you are no longer sure you want to hear. That night, sleep refused to come. Not because she was restless, but because her mind would not stop assembling pieces it had ignored for months. And as she lay beside him in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing, she felt an unfamiliar distance grow between their bodies, a space created not by movement but by knowledge. And she replayed old moments she had once dismissed, the sudden late errands, the unexplained smiles at his phone, the way certain names were never mentioned twice. And with each memory, the accidental message gained new weight, no longer isolated, but part of a pattern she could no longer deny. And in that quiet hour before dawn, she understood how betrayal often survives not because it is well hidden, but because love teaches us to look away, to trust explanations we want to believe. And staring at the ceiling as morning slowly approached, she made a silent decision, not to accuse, not to confront yet, but to stop protecting a version of reality that was slowly erasing her sense of truth. Morning arrived without relief, bringing light into a space that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And as she moved quietly through the house, making coffee, opening curtains, listening to the ordinary sounds of a day beginning, she felt as if she were observing her own life from a distance, aware that everything looked the same while nothing truly was. And when he joined her, speaking casually about plans and schedules, she answered automatically, surprised by how easily she could perform normalcy while her thoughts remained tightly wound around the message she had seen. And throughout the day, small moments continued to surface in her memory, conversations that ended too quickly, explanations that now felt rehearsed, affection that arrived at convenient times. And with each recollection, her certainty grew stronger, not fueled by jealousy or anger, but by the slow realization that trust, once cracked, changes the way truth reveals itself. And by the time evening came, she understood that this accidental discovery was no longer just an isolated incident. It was an invitation to stop ignoring her instincts, to listen to the quiet voice inside her that had been asking questions long before she was ready to hear the answers. By the third day after the message, the uncertainty had transformed into something heavier and more deliberate. Not panic, but awareness. And as she went about her routines, she noticed how carefully he managed information, how questions about his day were answered broadly but without detail, how his phone was always turned slightly away from her, and it became impossible to believe that these were coincidences. And yet, what troubled her most was not the evidence itself, but the realization that she had been slowly adjusting her behavior to accommodate his secrets, avoiding questions, accepting vagueness, trusting silence. And as she caught her reflection in a store window that afternoon, she barely recognized the woman staring back, someone quieter, more guarded, shaped by uncertainty. And in that moment, she understood that betrayal does not only harm the person being deceived, it quietly reshapes them, teaching them to doubt their instincts and soften their expectations. And standing there, surrounded by ordinary life continuing without pause, she felt a growing resolve settle inside her. Because whether or not she confronted him immediately, she could no longer remain passive inside a story that was changing her without her consent. That evening, she decided to stop living only inside her thoughts and begin paying attention to reality as it unfolded in front of her. And as they sat together at dinner, exchanging polite conversation about ordinary things, she noticed how easily he redirected topics, how smoothly he avoided specifics, and how practiced his calm appeared. And instead of reacting emotionally, she listened closely, not to his words alone, but to what he chose not to say. And in doing so, she felt a quiet strength replace the anxiety that had consumed her earlier, because observation gave her control. And later, when he stepped out to take a call, she remained at the table, staring at the place where he had been sitting, realizing that the hardest part of accidental betrayal is not discovering the truth, but accepting that you were never meant to find it. And as she sat there alone, she understood that whatever came next, confrontation or confirmation, she would no longer question her right to seek clarity, because trust should never require blindness to survive. The following morning, she woke with a strange sense of calm, not because the situation had improved, but because her mind had stopped running in circles and begun moving forward. And as she watched him get ready for the day, moving through familiar motions, adjusting his jacket, checking his phone, she noticed how effortless deception can look from the outside, how easily it blends into routine. And instead of confronting him immediately, she chose patience, understanding that truth often reveals itself more fully when given space. And throughout the day, she paid attention to small inconsistencies, the delays in his responses, the way plans shifted without explanation, the subtle defensiveness when she asked harmless questions. And with each observation, her accidental discovery felt less like a shock and more like confirmation.
And by the time evening arrived, she realized that this experience was no longer just about uncovering his betrayal, but about reclaiming her sense of self. Because in choosing awareness over denial, she was quietly stepping out of the role of the unsuspecting partner and into someone who trusted her instincts enough to face whatever truth awaited her, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. By the end of the week, the accidental discovery no longer felt accidental at all, but rather like the moment the truth finally decided she was ready to see it. And as she moved through the days, she noticed how her emotions had shifted from shock to clarity, from confusion to quiet determination. And while he continued to behave as though nothing had changed, she felt the distance between them grow more defined, shaped by everything she now understood but had not yet spoken aloud. And during a quiet afternoon alone, she found herself revisiting old memories, moments of closeness she once believed were unbreakable, now viewed through a lens of honesty rather than nostalgia. And instead of feeling only sadness, she felt something unexpected take hold, a sense of strength rooted in self-respect. Because recognizing betrayal does not weaken you, it reveals what you are no longer willing to accept. And as evening approached, she realized that the coming confrontation would not be about proving what he had done, but about affirming who she had become in the process, someone unwilling to live in uncertainty simply to preserve comfort. And standing at the threshold of that realization, she knew the truth, once revealed by accident, was now demanding to be faced intentionally. When the moment finally came, it did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic accusations, but with a quiet honesty that felt heavier than anger ever could. And as she stood in front of him, choosing her words carefully, she realized how much strength it took to speak calmly when everything inside her wanted to break. And instead of revealing how she had found out, she asked simple questions, giving him space to tell the truth on his own. And in the pauses between his answers, she watched realization slowly replace confidence, his expression shifting as he understood that the version of reality he had been maintaining was no longer intact. And when he finally admitted that the message had not been a mistake, that the connection had grown slowly and quietly, she felt a deep sadness settle in, not only for what he had done, but for the trust that had dissolved without either of them fully noticing. And as he spoke about confusion and regret, she listened without interruption, understanding that betrayal revealed by accident still ends the same way, with a choice between denial and truth. And standing there, grounded in the clarity she had earned, she knew that whatever path she chose next would be guided not by fear of loss, but by respect for herself and the life she deserved to live honestly. When the moment finally came, it did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic accusations, but with a quiet honesty that felt heavier than anger ever could. And as she stood in front of him, choosing her words carefully, she realized how much strength it took to speak calmly when everything inside her wanted to break. And instead of revealing how she had found out, she asked simple questions, giving him space to tell the truth on his own. And in the pauses between his answers, she watched realization slowly replace confidence, his expression shifting as he understood that the version of reality he had been maintaining was no longer intact. And when he finally admitted that the message had not been a mistake, that the connection had grown slowly and quietly, she felt a deep sadness settle in, not only for what he had done, but for the trust that had dissolved without either of them fully noticing. And as he spoke about confusion and regret, she listened without interruption, understanding that betrayal revealed by accident still ends the same way, with a choice between denial and truth. And standing there, grounded in the clarity she had earned, she knew that whatever path she chose next would be guided not by fear of loss, but by respect for herself and the life she deserved to live honestly. The days that followed were quieter than she expected, not filled with dramatic fallout, but with a steady process of emotional reckoning. And as she moved through her routines, packing away small shared items, adjusting habits, reclaiming spaces that had once belonged to both of them, she felt a mix of grief and relief coexist inside her. Because while loss was undeniable, so was the clarity that had emerged from the accidental revelation. And she realized how much energy she had spent over the years maintaining harmony, overlooking discomfort, trusting explanations that required too much faith. And now, standing on the other side of truth, she felt lighter despite the pain, because honesty had removed the constant background tension she had learned to live with. And when she finally reflected on how everything had been uncovered by chance rather than confession, she understood that some truths arrive unexpectedly not to punish, but to redirect, to interrupt a path that slowly leads away from oneself. And as she looked toward an uncertain future shaped by her own choices rather than hidden compromises, she felt a quiet confidence take hold, knowing that while betrayal had entered her life by accident, her decision to walk forward with self-respect was entirely intentional.